It's time to BS.
I do want to talk about, I flirted with this topic about a live stream ago with Jack. And I'm a bit of a wrestling nut in terms of the history of wrestling. And one of these particular topics that I have flirted with was the death of WCW. So Vice and Dark Side of the Ring are coming up with the documentary series. Well, they've released the last 3 episodes of Who Killed WCW. And it's something that I have been curious with. Because you can't really point the finger, per se, at who killed WCW from... There were 2 deaths of WCW. One in the 80s, in the mid-80s. Mid to late 80s. And then the late 90s to early 2000s. But to give you a little history note here, WCW was originally Jim Crockett Promotions back in the 70s and probably the 60s at that point. And Turner Broadcasting Network purchased Jim Crockett Promotions to become World Champ, or they basically rebranded to be World Championship Wrestling, WCW. Jim Herd was hired in the mid-80s and destroyed any competition WCW and Jim Crockett had with the then World Wrestling Federation up until, I want to say, mid-90s, like 95, 96. The whole fame story is that for 83 consecutive weeks, WCW took over the ratings over the WWF. 83 consecutive weeks. And Eric Bischoff's arrival had a lot to do with that. Eric Bischoff brought popularity, wrestling talent, and a deal with Turner Broadcasting to WCW, which they desperately needed. This is a guy who you cannot realistically point the finger at. He deserves some blame, but you can't point the finger directly at this man and say he deserves the blame. Because you can't blame one guy. There's a multitude of people that deserve the blame here for the death of WCW. And Bischoff's one of them. But to give him credit, you can point to Bischoff like you point to Tony Khan with AEW. To the credit of WCW and AEW, they gave a quote-unquote second home for professional wrestlers that wasn't the WWF at the time, or now WWE. It was a second home. And you have to give them a lot of credit for that. And he also helped boost up the popularity of professional wrestling in the mid-90s and brought up the Attitude Era of the WWF. Oh, Christ. I got Babe coming in. This could be good. Hi, baby. You're on live right now. What? Hello, you're on the speaker right now. I'll call you on unknown, okay, baby? All right, you got it, baby. All right, I love you. That's great. That's fucking great. I forgot this was a MacBook. I'm so used to this thing being a stinking HP laptop. That was funny. But as I was saying, Bischoff gave a lot. I'll give Bischoff a lot of credit here. And he also brought in Bret Hart, Hulk Hogan, who, by the way, turned heel in 96, which many thought was deemed impossible to turn Hulk Hogan heel. Bash to the Beach 1996, for those wondering. And also brought an undefeated streak for the World Heavyweight Champion at the time, Bill Goldberg, whose streak ended by the hands of Kevin Nash, but we don't talk about that here. But if you were to realistically point the finger at who killed WCW? You can point the finger at Bischoff a little bit. You can point the finger at Hogan for getting way too much creative control at the time. Jim Herd screwing shit up at way before Bischoff. But you could also point the finger at Vince Russo, or as Jim Cornette calls him, Vince Shitstain. And more importantly, you could blame the TNT executives at the time for just messing everything up. Because when WCW was falling down the cliff in the late 90s, early 2000s, TNT pulled the trigger on them, and then just the rest is history. So it was a bitter, sad, bitter end, honestly, at the time for WCW. It's a shame because they had a lot of momentum going for them. It was a real shame. If the question here is, if WCW were to still exist, do you think they would still thrive? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. So there's that.